Picture this. You're standing knee-deep in a lake that hasn't existed for 5,000 years. The water is warm, dragonflies skim the surface. Somewhere behind you, cattle are grazing on grass that no longer grows here. Because this lake, right now, sits in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Not sand dunes, not endless, dead nothing. A lake, fish in it, herons wading the edges, and a few kids nearby splashing around, learning to float while an adult watches from the shore. Here's the part that should stop you. That scene actually happened, and somebody left proof of it, painted in red ochre on a rock wall, in a place that today hasn't seen a drop of standing water in over 5,000 years. So how does a swimmer end up painted on a wall in the driest desert on the planet? And here's a fact most people never stop to think about. Humans aren't actually born knowing how to swim. It's not instinct. It has to be taught every single time by someone who already knows how, which raises a much bigger question. If nobody's born with it, where did the very first lesson come from? Let's go find out. Fast forward to 1933. A Hungarian explorer named Laszlo Almasi is crawling on his hands and knees into a shallow rock shelter out on a remote sandstone plateau where Egypt meets Libya. There's no shade out here, no water, nothing but wind and stone for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. He lifts his lamp, and on the wall in front of him are human figures, arms stretched forward, legs trailing back, swimming. At first, this doesn't make sense. Why would anyone paint swimmers in the one place on Earth guaranteed to never have a pool? Most people assume the desert has always been a desert. That's not what happened. Around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, this exact stretch of the Sahara was green. Lakes, grasslands, herds of cattle, and somewhere to the south, a body of water archaeologists nicknamed Mega Chad, bigger than modern Germany. The people who painted those swimmers weren't imagining anything. They were drawing their own childhood. But that only explains where the art came from. It doesn't explain who taught the first human being ever to trust their body in open water instead of panicking and going under. And that's where the story gets a lot older than a desert lake. Now imagine a completely different scene. You're on a beach in Southeast Asia, roughly 65,000 years ago. In front of you is open ocean, and somewhere out past the haze, a coastline you can't see, can't prove exists, and have never visited. Your entire group is about to get in boats and go anyway. Children, elders, fire, somehow kept alive on the water. Researchers eventually discovered something that made this crossing even harder to explain. The ancient sea channels between these islands, the stretch scientists now call Wallacea, weren't shallow wading distance. Some of the gaps were 10, 20, even 40 kilometers of open water, with currents that don't care how badly you want to survive. Land wasn't just far, it was invisible. Think about that for a second. You don't get an entire community, babies included, across 40 kilometers of ocean on luck alone. Somebody in that group understood currents, understood how a body floats, how panic drowns people faster than exhaustion does, and how to keep a child calm enough not to fight the water. That's not instinct, that's a curriculum. And it means, whoever they were, they'd already been teaching this lesson for generations before the crossing ever happened. So the question isn't whether ancient humans could swim, it's how long they'd been quietly practicing it before anyone thought to write it down. Or paint it. Here's where the evidence gets strange. In 2019, a researcher named Eric Trinkaus was studying a batch of ancient skulls, Neanderthal skulls, some from a cave in France called La Chapelle aux Saints, others from Krapina in Croatia, and he noticed something odd growing inside their ear canals, small bony ridges. At first, that detail seems irrelevant, until you learn what causes it. Doctors today see the exact same bony growths in one very specific group of people, cold water surfers. It's nicknamed surfer's ear, and it only forms after years of repeated exposure to cold water and wind hitting the ear canal, over and over, for seasons at a time. Neanderthals, with surfer's ear, that's not proof they were doing backstroke across glacial rivers for fun, but it does mean they were in cold water constantly, waiting for shellfish, hunting waterfowl, doing something that soaked them again and again until their own skeletons physically changed shape in response. Our closest evolutionary cousins had a working relationship with water tens of thousands of years before that desert lake in the Sahara even existed. Everything up to this point was really just the setup, because knowing humans could swim is one thing. The real question is, how? And that's where the story stops being about instinct entirely, and starts being about a piece of technology you'd probably never guess: a dead goat. Picture a soldier standing on the bank of the Tigris River in what's now Iraq, sometime around the 7th century BCE. He can't swim, or not well enough to trust his life to it, and the army needs to cross today. So he does something that sounds almost too simple to work. He takes an animal skin, scraped clean, stitched shut at the legs, and blows it full of air until it's tight as a drum, straps it to his chest, and walks into the river. That single skin traps roughly the equivalent of 6 deep human breaths. Strapped under the ribs, it's enough buoyancy to keep a grown man floating high in fast-moving current, even in armor, even if he can barely swim a stroke. Stone carvings from the Assyrian palace at Nineveh show entire rows of soldiers crossing rivers exactly this way. The Greek writer Xenophon described the same trick being used by his own soldiers crossing the Tigris in 401 BCE. This wasn't a rare survival hack. It was standard military equipment, essentially the world's first life jacket, made from whatever was already tied to your belt. But here's the part that's easy to miss. The goal was never to swim straight across. Fighting the current head-on gets you killed. Instead, swimmers angled their bodies diagonally upstream and let the river carry them sideways as they crossed, accepting they'd land dozens of meters downstream from where they started. The trick wasn't strength, it was surrender, aimed in the right direction. And that idea, stop fighting, start drifting, explains one of history's most famous river legends, and quietly proves it was probably exaggerated. The Roman historian Livy tells the story of a soldier named Horatius Cocles, who in the 6th century BCE held a bridge alone against an entire invading army, then leapt into the Tiber River in full armor and swam to safety as arrows rained down around him. It's a great story. Here's the surprising part. The Tiber in flood moves an estimated 20,000 cubic feet of water every single second. That's not a river. That's a brown, churning wall of force that doesn't part for anybody's bronze breastplate. A straight line swim in that current, in full armor? Almost impossible. But a Roman soldier who'd grown up learning the same principle used on the Tigris. Stay loose, present the widest part of your body to the current, use the calm pockets behind bridge pilings to rest, and drift diagonally instead of fighting straight across. Could plausibly survive it. The myth remembers a hero. What it accidentally preserves is a swimming lesson that Roman kids were taught by the riverbank, generation after generation. And that's really the whole pattern, once you step back far enough to see it. A Neanderthal wading a freezing river for shellfish. A child floating in a Saharan lake 9,000 years ago, arms out, trusting the water to hold her. A soldier gripping a goatskin on the Tigris. None of them were born knowing how to do this. Every one of them had someone, a parent, an older cousin, a stranger on a riverbank, physically show them how to stop panicking long enough to float, which is maybe the strangest thing about the whole story. We like to think of survival as fighting, pushing harder, swimming faster, refusing to give in. But the one skill that actually kept humans alive in water over and over across 65,000 years and 2 different species of humans was the opposite. It was learning to go still, to stop treating the water like an enemy and let it hold you instead. And maybe that's not just a swimming lesson. Maybe it's the one lesson every generation still has to learn all over again, in one form or another, that the thing trying to pull you under is usually the same thing that will hold you up the moment you stop fighting it.